There is a version of World War I that most people carry in their minds without ever examining it. It involves mud and heroism. It involves poets and poppies. It involves young men going over the top with a strange and luminous dignity, as though the industrial slaughter of an entire generation could be softened by the right kind of language. That version is not entirely false, but it is carefully constructed. It was built during the war by governments afraid of collapse, maintained after the war by institutions afraid of reckoning, and absorbed by cultures that found it easier to grieve beautifully than to understand clearly. What actually spread through the trenches of the Western Front, the Eastern Front, the Gallipoli Peninsula, the Mesopotamian desert, and the shattered hillsides of Italy was something far more specific, far more biological, and far more difficult to romanticize. It was a set of habits, not heroic habits, not poetic habits, habits born of necessity, of confinement, of institutional neglect, and of the slow psychological erosion that occurs when human beings are kept alive in conditions designed, inadvertently or otherwise, to destroy them. These habits spread not through orders or ideology, but through proximity, through shared trenches, shared water, shared air, shared silence. Men learned from other men how to survive the unsurvivable, and in the learning, they became something the recruiting posters had never imagined. The first thing to understand about trench life is that it was not primarily dangerous in the way that people imagine. It was not constant artillery barrages and relentless attacks. For most men, on most days, the trenches were simply boring, grinding, punishing, filthy, vermin-infested, waterlogged, and boring. The danger came in concentrated bursts. The horror came in concentrated bursts. But the daily texture of trench existence was defined by waiting, by routine, and by the slow accumulation of small miseries that individually meant nothing and collectively destroyed a man from the inside. It is within that texture that the habits formed, and the first habit, the one that spread fastest and dug deepest, was the habit of eating in the presence of death. Within weeks of the war's beginning, men on both sides of the wire discovered that the geography of the trench system made it nearly impossible to separate the living from the dead. The dead did not go away. They could not be retrieved without risk. They accumulated in no man's land, in the parapets, in the walls of the trenches themselves, on the Somme, on the Ypres salient, at Verdun. Men ate their rations sitting beside bodies in various states of decomposition, not because they wanted to, not because they were indifferent, but because there was nowhere else to sit, nothing else to do, and the army had a schedule, and the schedule required eating. The habit that formed was not callousness. It was something more mechanical than that. The mind learned to partition the sensory experience, to eat and not smell, to chew and not see. Medical officers noted this with a kind of clinical unease. Soldiers who had initially vomited at the proximity of corpses could, within a matter of weeks, eat their tinned bully beef without visible distress, while seated within arm's reach of a body that had been there for 3 days. This was not strength. It was the brain's emergency protocol, the same one that allows surgeons to cut into living flesh, the same one that allows undertakers to work. But it arose in the trenches not through professional training but through mass exposure. It spread the way all trench habits spread, through watching other men survive. The second habit was the talking to the dead. This one is less documented because it was embarrassing to the institutional military and because the men who practiced it rarely spoke of it openly. But it appears in diaries, in letters that made it past censors who were looking for operational information rather than psychological detail, and in the post-war testimonies of men who felt, decades later, that they could finally describe what the trenches had actually been. Men spoke to dead comrades, not in grief, not in ceremony, but in the ordinary conversational tones of men who had shared close quarters for months. They would address a body by name. They would narrate the day's small events. They would make remarks about the weather, about the food, about something a sergeant had said. The explanation offered by veterans who survived and later reflected on it was consistent. The silence was worse than the speech. When the men who had been there were gone and nothing acknowledged their absence, the absence became too large to occupy the same space as a living mind. Talking filled the gap with something that had the texture of normalcy. It was a coping mechanism, but like all coping mechanisms that spread through a population under stress, it also became a ritual, a shared practice. By the middle years of the war, new arrivals to established trench sections would observe this behavior in veterans and, without being instructed, adopt it. The habit replicated itself not through teaching, but through observation and absorption. The third habit, and one of the most physically consequential, was the systematic ignoring of wounds. The medical infrastructure of the First World War was overwhelmed almost from the beginning. The scale of casualties during the opening campaigns exceeded every projection that medical planners had made. The system was not designed for industrialized attrition. It was designed, in broad concept, for a shorter and more conventional war. What emerged in practice was a triage so brutal that it functioned less as medicine than as a sorting mechanism. Men learned quickly that reporting a minor wound could result in outcomes worse than simply enduring it. A wound bad enough to send a man down the line to a casualty clearing station might result in infection, in amputation, in death from the very treatment meant to prevent death. A wound not bad enough to send him down the line would be bandaged at the regimental aid post, and the man returned to the trench within hours. The rational calculation, arrived at independently by thousands of men, was to endure whatever could be endured. A shrapnel fragment lodged in the shoulder. A gas wound that had damaged the eyes but not blinded entirely. A fracture that had knitted imperfectly, but that bore weight. Men carried these injuries for months because the alternative was a system they had learned not to trust. The habit of wound tolerance spread through example. A man who watched a veteran continue functioning with an injury that would have, in civilian life, required immediate surgery, internalized a new threshold for what was acceptable. His threshold shifted. When he himself was wounded, he applied the shifted threshold. The process cascaded. By the war's middle period, the baseline expectation of physical damage among frontline soldiers had moved so far from the civilian norm that medical officers examining men who had been rotated out of the line were routinely finding injuries of substantial severity that the men had not reported and had, in some cases, stopped noticing. The fourth habit was lice management. This requires dwelling on because it was so pervasive and because its effects were so concrete. Every man in the trenches had lice. Not most men. Every man. The Laus pediculus humanus corporis found in the Western Front trenches a perfect environment. The conditions of warmth, confinement, limited hygiene, and mass density of human bodies created a population density of the parasite that made elimination effectively impossible under field conditions. Delousing was a daily activity for most frontline soldiers, and it became ritualized in ways that reveal something important about how communal life adapted to extreme circumstances. The practice that became most widespread involved running a candle flame along the seams of a garment where lice laid their eggs. The crackling sound was described in numerous diaries. Men would perform this procedure while sitting with comrades in the same conversational register as a normal evening's activity. The social character of delousing is significant. It was not private. It became one of the communal rhythms of trench existence, a shared practice that took on a social texture. Men deloused together. They compared methods. They discussed the relative infestation levels in different sections of trench. In the larger context of what the lice were doing to the men's bodies, this domestication of the problem is striking. The lice caused trench fever, a relapsing febrile illness caused by Bartonella quintana, which the louse transmits through its feces. The fever incapacitated men for weeks at a time and was responsible for a significant fraction of the war's total manpower loss. The British Army lost an estimated equivalent of 5 divisions to trench fever over the course of the war. The habit of managing lice rather than eliminating them was not a choice anyone made consciously. It was the adaptation to an impossibility, and it spread the way the lice themselves spread, by contact, by proximity, by the simple fact of men occupying the same narrow space. The fifth habit was the carrying of corpse equipment. This is one of the most clinically documented and least discussed of the trench habits. When a man died in the trenches, his personal equipment did not leave with him. The supply system for the British, French, German, and other armies of the Western Front was under constant strain. Replacement equipment arrived late, in insufficient quantities, or not at all. The practical consequence was that men who survived began carrying items stripped from men who had not. A better pair of boots, a gas mask in better condition, a tin hat that fit properly, a ground sheet less rotten than the one issued. This was not looting in any morally freighted sense. It was logistics adapted to scarcity. But the habit had psychological dimensions that the men who practiced it recognized and that military psychologists would later study. The object retained something of the man who had worn it. Veterans described the odd familiarity of wearing a dead comrade's boots. The way the boot was already shaped by another man's foot. The way a coat carried the smell of someone who no longer existed. The habit of taking from the dead became so standardized that it was not remarked upon in official reports. Chaplains who might have raised moral objections did not, because they too understood the conditions. The army did not forbid it, because the army needed its men equipped. What it produced was a blurring of the boundary between the possessions of the living and the dead that further eroded the psychological partition that normally separates the two categories. The sixth habit was the practice of not reading letters immediately. This seems small. It is not small. In the conditions of the trenches, a letter from home could destroy a man's capacity to function if read at the wrong moment. The emotional reorientation required to read a wife's description of the garden, a mother's account of a younger sibling's first day at school, a friend's news from a world that had continued existing in the soldier's absence. That reorientation was a luxury that the trenches could not always afford. Men developed the habit of carrying letters unopened for days, sometimes weeks, waiting for a moment of stillness that might never come. Waiting for a psychological state that might permit the grief of displacement without rendering a man non-functional. The censorship system added another dimension. Men writing home knew their letters would be read by officers before dispatch. They developed a second language, a parallel vocabulary for describing what was happening without triggering the censor's pencil and without terrifying the people at home whose worry was itself a burden. The habit of coded communication spread through the ranks. Men taught each other, without formal instruction, the grammar of the censored letter, how to convey that conditions were intolerable without writing that conditions were intolerable, how to describe the deaths of companions without naming the dead in ways that would reach family before the official notification. This was an entire communicative adaptation. A new literature, private and distributed, unrecorded because it was designed to be unreadable. The seventh habit was what would now be recognized as a form of hypervigilance that persisted after the triggering conditions ended. In the trenches, the ability to distinguish between sounds that meant immediate danger and sounds that did not was a survival skill. The difference in trajectory between an incoming shell and an outgoing one. The specific frequency that indicated gas rather than smoke. The silence that preceded a sniper's shot rather than the silence that preceded nothing. Men trained themselves, unconsciously and with the urgency of the organism under threat, to monitor the acoustic environment with extreme precision. This training was irreversible. Veterans who survived the war and returned to civilian life found the training persisting in contexts where it had no function. The sound of a car backfiring, the sound of a door slamming, the sound of fireworks on a national holiday. The nervous system did not know the war had ended. It continued running its threat detection protocols in environments where the protocols produced only social embarrassment and private terror. The habit of hypervigilance spread through the trenches by the same mechanism as all survival skills. The man who did not develop it was more likely to die. The man who did develop it had better odds of living long enough to carry the habit home. The selection pressure was absolute. The eighth habit was eating at speed. Not eating quickly because of personal preference or impatience, but eating with the particular mechanical urgency of a man who has learned that the time available for eating may end without warning. Mealtimes in the trenches were not protected. Artillery did not observe meal schedules. Raids could be called at any moment. The men who survived adapted by eating as if every meal might be interrupted, which it often was. The habit of speed eating became so deeply conditioned that it persisted long after the triggering conditions were gone. Veterans described eating dinner in post-war kitchens with the same focused, rapid, eyes-down intensity with which they had eaten in the trench. Wives and families noticed. Some found it amusing, some found it disturbing. The men themselves often could not explain it and did not associate it with the war, because habits absorbed through years of conditioning do not announce their origins. They simply exist as the body's learned way of doing a thing. The ninth habit was the particular relationship with rats that trench veterans developed. The rats of the Western Front were extraordinary in their numbers and in the boldness they developed through close cohabitation with millions of men. Rattus norvegicus, the brown rat, found in the trenches an environment of extraordinary abundance. The combination of food waste, corpses, and warm human bodies created a population explosion that contemporary accounts describe in terms that strain credibility until one examines the primary sources carefully. Rats ran across sleeping men. They ate rations. They ate the dead. They ate the living when the living were too exhausted or too ill to resist. The initial response of men arriving at the front was horror and active resistance. Within weeks, that response typically gave way to something more complex. The rats were there. They could not be eliminated. They had to be coexisted with. Men developed working arrangements with the rats that had the character of a negotiation. Leave the rats a portion of the ration scraps, and the rats would be less likely to attempt the ration directly. Kill a rat when possible, but do not make it the primary activity. The habit of coexistence with vermin, of accepting the presence of something repugnant as a fixed condition of the environment, generalized. Men who learned to coexist with rats in the trench found themselves less reactive to other forms of environmental degradation. The tolerance curve had been permanently recalibrated. The 10th habit was the specific practice of trench humor. This is described in memoirs and letters with a consistency that makes its character clear. It was not the humor of men finding joy in difficulty. It was the humor of men using laughter as a precision tool to prevent psychological collapse. The jokes that circulated in the trenches were predominantly about death, about the body, about the absurdity of the institutional machinery of the war. A man could joke about the shell that had narrowly missed him. A man could not, without sanction from his comrades, express sustained fear about the shell that might not miss him next time. The humor served as a lid on the emotional pressure cooker. It allowed men to acknowledge the proximity of death without affording death the dignity of fear. It spread because it worked. A new man arriving at the front who resisted the dark humor, who tried to maintain a more conventional emotional register in the face of conventional emotional stimuli, was subject to gentle and then less gentle pressure from veterans to adopt the idiom. The humor was not optional. It was structural. It held the group together in the same way that a membrane holds a cell together. Without it, the individual emotional reactions would have been impossible to contain in a shared space. The 11th habit was a particular form of prayer that diverged sharply from the institutional religion of the chaplains and the church. The institutional church had, in most of the belligerent nations, aligned itself with the war effort. Sermons in churches in England and France and Germany and Austria described the war in terms of divine purpose, national righteousness, sacrifice as spiritual elevation. The men in the trenches knew this was not describing their experience. The gap between the theological interpretation being offered to them and the physical reality they were living inside was too large to be bridged by conventional faith. What emerged was a more private and more desperate religious practice. Men prayed not for victory. They prayed for specific outcomes, that the shell already in the air would land 6 feet to the left, that the next 24 hours would pass without being required to go over the top, that a particular friend would not be in the party selected for the night raid. This was prayer as negotiation with whatever machinery was running the universe, stripped of theology, stripped of institutional form, reduced to the bare urgency of a consciousness that did not want to stop existing. It spread because it addressed a need that nothing else addressed. The chaplains, who reported to the same institutional hierarchy that was sending men into the wire, could not provide what the private prayer provided. The private prayer did not promise meaning. It did not promise justice. It offered only the possibility of intervention, however irrational, in a system that seemed otherwise indifferent to individual survival. The 12th habit was related and darker. It was the habit of interpreting random events as signs. This is not unique to the trenches. Human beings, under conditions of extreme and unpredictable danger, reliably develop superstitious pattern recognition as a way of imposing a sense of agency on a situation that provides none. In the trenches, this tendency was amplified by the extreme randomness of the killing. Men could not identify what had made some men survive and others die. In the absence of a rational account, the human mind generates irrational ones, and the irrational ones spread through a population faster than any rational account could. The lucky charm, the specific routine that had been observed on the morning of every day that had not yet killed its observer. The number, the token, the picture carried close to the body. The men who survived accumulated these objects and practices. Confirmation bias did the rest. The men who had the charm and died were simply dead and could not testify. The men who had the charm and lived attributed their survival to it. The habit spread. By the middle of the war, the personal talismanic systems of individual soldiers had become elaborate, idiosyncratic, and fiercely protected. Officers who understood the psychology permitted it. Officers who attempted to discipline it found that undermining a soldier's superstitious system could produce more damage to fighting effectiveness than allowing it. The 13th habit was the practice of sleep, wherever and whenever the body could achieve it. The sleep deprivation in the trenches was chronic and severe. The standard British Army rotation system, in theory, allowed periods of rest. In practice, the rest was constantly interrupted, abbreviated, or entirely denied by operational necessity, by shelling, by the duties of maintenance that a trench required to remain functional, by the anxiety that even the most exhausted man could not entirely suppress. The body adapted by learning to sleep in positions and in contexts that would have been impossible before the war, standing up, in noise, with one part of the nervous system maintaining a sufficient level of alert to respond to emergency stimuli. The veterans of the trenches developed what amounts to a split sleep architecture, a partial sleep that rested the body without fully releasing the vigilance function. This habit, too, proved irreversible in many men. Veterans who returned home found themselves unable to sleep in the deep and continuous manner of people who had not learned to sleep in the trenches. They woke at sounds that had no significance. They could not tolerate the vulnerability of deep sleep. The 14th habit was the consumption of alcohol as medicine. This is not unique to the trenches in principle. Alcohol has been used in military contexts throughout recorded history. What was distinctive about the First World War was the systematic institutional incorporation of alcohol into the daily management of soldiers. The British Army issued a rum ration. The French Army issued wine and sometimes spirits. The German Army issued schnapps. These were not informal arrangements. They were logistical operations involving supply chains, distribution schedules, and accounting systems. The institutional justification was warming, preventive against the cold and wet, morale-sustaining. The actual function was more direct. Alcohol blunted the edge of fear sufficiently to allow men to perform actions that their intact nervous systems would have refused to perform. Going over the top, taking part in night raids, holding a position under artillery fire. The institutional rum ration before an attack was not a luxury. It was a performance-enabling mechanism. Men who had never drunk before the war developed drinking habits in the trenches that followed them home. Men who had drunk moderately before the war developed dependencies in the trenches that destroyed their post-war lives. The habit of reaching for alcohol as a modulator of emotional state, a habit acquired in the specific institutional context of the war, spread through the male population of every belligerent nation and left a demographic signature in post-war addiction statistics that researchers have been analyzing ever since. The 15th habit was the specific practice of trench maintenance as psychological anchor. The trenches required constant work to remain functional. Waterlogged sections needed pumping, collapsed walls needed repairing, duckboards needed replacing, parapets needed revetting, latrines needed attention that does not require detailed description. The work was unglamorous, unrecognized, and relentless. But the men who adapted best to trench life were consistently the men who absorbed themselves in this maintenance work during the intervals between operational activity. The work provided something that the trench environment otherwise denied: a task with a beginning, a middle, and an end. A problem that could be solved. In a situation of overwhelming uncontrollability, the small controllable task became a psychological refuge. Veterans described the almost meditative quality of repairing a section of trench wall. The focus required by the physical task crowded out the mental material that could not be processed. The habit of maintaining physical focus as a way of managing psychological content spread through the ranks, not through any instruction but through observation of which men were holding together and which men were not. The 16th habit was the particular practice around personal territory within the communal space. The trenches were crowded. Privacy was essentially non-existent. Men lived, ate, slept, relieved themselves, were wounded, and died in a space that afforded almost none of the physical separations that human beings use to maintain psychological integrity. What developed was a set of informal territorial conventions that created symbolic privacy in the absence of physical privacy. A man's sleeping spot was his, within the social code of the trench, as absolutely as if it had walls and a door. Another man's kit was not to be touched without permission, even if the other man was dead, until a protocol involving the officers or the senior NCO had been observed. The space a man occupied while he was eating or while he was writing a letter was understood to be temporarily bounded by an invisible partition that his comrades respected. These conventions spread and solidified into something that functioned like a trench constitution, an unwritten body of rules governing the shared space that had no institutional sanction but enforced itself through social pressure with extraordinary consistency. Men who violated the conventions were made to feel it. The conventions protected the individual's capacity to function in circumstances that would otherwise have been psychologically impossible. They were an adaptation to confinement, and they were an adaptation that the individual carried afterward, in the form of an unusually strong attachment to personal space and personal territory that observers of returning veterans consistently noted. The 17th habit was the practice of writing without writing. The censorship system meant that truthful communication home was impossible in any direct form, but men found other channels. Objects sent home carried information that letters could not. A stone from the trench floor, a piece of wire from the barbed entanglement, a button from a German uniform. These objects said things about proximity to the enemy, about conditions, about psychological state, that the words in the accompanying letter carefully did not say. Families learned to read the objects. Wives and mothers developed interpretive skills that they did not explicitly teach, but that passed through demonstration and implication. The wife who received a small piece of shrapnel extracted from her husband's kit, without explanation, knew something about what her husband's days were like that she could not be told directly. This parallel communication system spread through the population at home as it spread through the men in the trenches. It was a distributed workaround to an institutional constraint, and it left the war's real texture in 1 million private homes in a form that the official record completely omitted. The 18th habit was the systematic accommodation of officers perceived as incompetent. This is one of the most dangerous and most carefully suppressed aspects of trench culture. The institutional hierarchy of the British, French, and other armies was not primarily a system for promoting competence. It was a system for reproducing class structure under military nomenclature. The officer class was drawn predominantly from a social stratum that had access to education and social capital, but not necessarily to the qualities required by the specific demands of trench warfare. The result was a distribution of officer quality that the men in the ranks understood with precise clarity because their lives depended on that clarity. The habit that developed was not mutiny, though mutiny did occur, and its occurrence was systematically suppressed from the record. The habit was a form of managed compliance that permitted the form of orders to be observed while using the practical knowledge of experienced NCOs and veterans to root around the consequences of incompetent orders whenever this was operationally possible. An order to advance across ground that experienced men knew to be perfectly covered by enemy fire would be received with formal compliance and executed in a form that retained the appearance of the order while minimizing its deadliest elements. This was not always possible. When it was not possible, men died in the execution of orders that their own experience told them were certain to produce their deaths. But when it was possible, the practical wisdom of the frontline soldiers operated as a shadow management system beneath the official hierarchy. The habit spread through NCOs, who trained new men in the culture of practical survival, alongside the official culture of military discipline. The 19th habit was a specific change in what men found funny, frightening, beautiful, or disgusting. The recalibration of the aesthetic sense under conditions of extreme habituation to horror produced a perceptual shift that men carried home, and that made them, in ways they could not explain, and that their families could not understand, permanently different from who they had been before. Things that the pre-war self had found beautiful: a field of poppies, the sound of artillery at a distance, the smell of certain chemicals, could produce in the veteran a response that was disconnected from beauty. Things that the pre-war self had found frightening: sudden loud noises, darkness, the proximity of strangers, could produce responses that were excessive and uncontrollable in ways that embarrassed men who had functioned with complete composure under conditions of objectively extreme danger. The displacement of the fear response from its original context into the peacetime environment was not a failure of will. It was the persistence of a learned response in a changed context. The disgust threshold had similarly shifted. The pre-war disgust response to bodies, to certain smells, to the physical realities of injury and death, had been overridden by habituation. What the veteran found manageable, the civilian found appalling. The gap between these two versions of the normal human response to death was a gap that many veterans could not bridge and that many families could not cross to meet them on the other side. The 20th habit, the last and in many ways the most consequential, was the habit of silence about what had actually happened. This was the habit that outlasted all the others, that outlasted the men who carried it, that shaped the entire cultural representation of the war for the decades following. Men came home and did not speak of the trenches in any terms that conveyed the reality of the trenches. They spoke in the official vocabulary, in the euphemisms of valor and sacrifice and heroism, or they spoke of nothing at all. They did not speak of the eating beside the dead. They did not speak of the conversations with corpses. They did not speak of the wounds carried silently for months. They did not speak of the systematic management of incompetent officers. They did not speak of the rum consumed before going over the top. They did not speak of the talismans, the superstitions, the private prayers for the shell to land 6 feet to the left. They did not speak of the rats, the lice, the state of the men they had left behind, the condition of the ground they had walked across, the specific quality of the silence that preceded a sniper's shot. The silence was not always a choice. Some men had no words for what they had experienced because the language available to them had not been built for those specific experiences. The English language in 1918 had no terms for what the 20th century would eventually name. It had no word for post-traumatic stress. It had no clinical vocabulary for the dissociative adaptations that had allowed millions of men to function in conditions that would otherwise have destroyed them before they could be of any military use. Some men were silent because they did not know how to speak. Some were silent because they had tried to speak and watched the incomprehension in the faces of people who loved them and had concluded that the attempt was not worth the cost. Some were silent because the institutions that had sent them had a very clear interest in the particular shape of the silence. In the official version, the version without lice and rats and rum and corpse boots and conversations with the dead, because the official version was the one that could be used again. The one that could be mobilized the next time mobilization was required. The one that could be placed on recruiting posters and spoken in parliamentary speeches and taught in schools. The silence spread the way all the other habits spread, through proximity, through observation, through the absorption of a social norm that had enough structural support to sustain itself across generations. The men who had been there were silent. Their silence was interpreted by those who had not been there as dignity, as modesty, as the appropriate response of men who had seen things too terrible to describe to those who had not shared the experience. The interpretation was not entirely wrong, but it produced as its consequence a population that understood the war through the official vocabulary, that grieved in the official idiom, that incorporated the war into national memory in a form that the institutions that had created the war could live with comfortably. The poppies, the poet's lines, the neat white rows of stones in the military cemeteries, each stone identical, each stone legible, each stone bearing a name and a date and the insignia of a regiment, a clean administrative closure imposed on a process that had been neither clean nor administrative in its execution. By the armistice of November 1918, the belligerent nations of the war had mobilized approximately 65 million men. Of those, approximately 17 million had died. Approximately 21 million had been wounded. The wounded figure, which receives less attention than the death toll, represents men who returned to civilian life, carrying in their bodies the physical trace of the trench habits, the shrapnel never removed, the gas damage persisting in lungs and eyes, the improperly healed fractures, the conditions contracted through the management of wounds that the medical system could not absorb. The administrative processing of casualties on the Western Front had, by the war's middle period, achieved a routinization of such density that the paperwork generated by a single major offensive could fill rooms. The forms for the dead were standardized. The notification letters were templated. The pension applications for the wounded were processed by clerks who handled hundreds per day, who had developed their own professional adaptations to the content of what they were reading, their own version of the soldier's habit of eating beside the dead, a bureaucratic partition between the form being processed and the human being the form described. The industrial machinery that had produced the casualties produced the paperwork about the casualties with equal efficiency, and the paperwork gave the casualties a legibility, a systematized identity as administrative categories that their physical reality in the trenches had not possessed. The war had demonstrated something that the institutions that prosecuted it preferred not to have demonstrated, that human beings could be habituated to almost any condition of existence given sufficient time, sufficient isolation from alternatives, and sufficient institutional pressure. The habituation was not degradation in any simple sense. The men who developed the trench habits were not becoming less than human. They were demonstrating the extraordinary adaptability of the human organism. But the adaptation was purchased at a cost that the institution was not equipped to account for, that the official record was not structured to capture, and that the official peace was not designed to address. The men came home carrying habits built for a world that had ended. They entered a world that wanted to believe the habits had not been necessary, that the men who carried them had not needed to develop them, that the war had been what the recruiting posters had claimed it was, rather than what the trenches had actually been. The gap between those two versions of the war was the space in which the 20th century lived for decades. In some respects, it lives there still. The forms are still filed. The stones are still identical. The silence is still, in certain quarters, in certain institutional contexts, preferred to the alternative.